Tonight we present one who has become a very dear friend of this institution. Her topic is Apollo 11 and Dionysus, in parentheses, at Woodstock. When a crowd assembles on a night like this, so that many have already been turned away, you don't want to hear me. You want to hear Miss Rand, whom I now present.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, on July 16, 1969, 1 million people from all over the country converged on Cape Kennedy, Florida, to witness the launching of Apollo 11 that carried astronauts to the moon. On August 15th, 300,000 people from all over the country converged on Bethel, New York, near the town of Woodstock, to witness a rock music festival. These two events were news, not philosophical theory. These were facts of our actual existence, the kind of facts, according to both modern philosophers and practical businessmen, that philosophy has nothing to do with. But if one cares to understand the meaning of these two events, to grasp their roots and their consequences, one will understand the power of philosophy and learn to recognize the specific forms in which philosophical abstractions appear in our actual existence. The issue in this case is the alleged dichotomy of reason versus emotion. This dichotomy has been presented in many variants in the history of philosophy, but its most colorfully eloquent statement was given by Friedrich Nietzsche. In The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music, Nietzsche claims that he observed two opposite elements in Greek tragedies which he saw as metaphysical principles inherent in the nature of reality. He named them after two Greek gods: Apollo, the god of light, and Dionysus, the god of wine. Apollo, in Nietzsche's metaphysics, is the symbol of beauty, order, wisdom, efficacy, though Nietzsche equivocates about this last. That is the symbol of reason. Dionysus is the symbol of drunkenness, or rather, Nietzsche cites drunkenness as his identification of what Dionysus stands for: wild, primeval feelings, orgiastic joy, the dark, the savage, the unintelligible element in man, that is the symbol of emotion. Apollo, according to Nietzsche, is a necessary element, but an unreliable and thus inferior guide to existence that gives man a superficial view of reality, the illusion of an orderly universe. Dionysus is the free, unfettered spirit that offers man, by means of a mysterious intuition induced by wine and drugs, a more profound vision of a different kind of reality, and is thus the superior. And indicating that Nietzsche knew clearly what he was talking about, even though he chose to express it in a safely, drunkenly Dionysian manner, Apollo represents the principle of individuality, while Dionysus leads man, quote, into complete self-forgetfulness, unquote, and into merging with the oneness of nature. Those who, at a superficial reading, take Nietzsche to be an advocate of individualism, please note. This much is true. Reason is the faculty of an individual to be exercised individually, and it is only dark, irrational emotions obliterating his mind, that can enable a man to melt, merge, and dissolve into a mob or a tribe. We may accept Nietzsche's symbols, but not his estimate of their respective values, nor the metaphysical necessity of a reason-emotion dichotomy. It is not true that reason and emotion are irreconcilable antagonists, or that emotions are a wild, unknowable, ineffable element in man. But this is what emotions become for those who do not care to know what they feel and who attempt to subordinate reason to their emotions. For every variant of such attempts, as well as for their consequences, the image of Dionysus is an appropriate symbol. Symbolic figures are a valuable adjunct to philosophy. They help men to integrate and bear in mind the essential meaning of complex issues. Apollo and Dionysus represent the fundamental conflict of our age. And for those who may regard them as floating abstractions, reality has offered two perfect fiction-like dramatizations of these abstract symbols at Cape Kennedy and at Woodstock. They were perfect in every respect demanded of serious fiction. They concretized the essentials of the two principles in action in a pure, extreme, isolated form. The fact that the spacecraft was called Apollo is merely a coincidence, but a helpful coincidence. If you want to know fully what the conflict of reason versus irrational emotion means, in fact, in reality, on Earth, keep these two events in mind. It means Apollo 11 versus the Woodstock Festival. Remember also that you are asked to make a choice between these two, and that the whole weight of today's culture is being used to push you to the side of and into the mud of Woodstock. In my article, Apollo 11, in The Objectivist, September 1969, I discussed the meaning and the greatness of the moon landing. And parenthetically, for those interested in the subject, I would very much recommend that you do read that article, because in today's lecture I would not have the time to discuss in detail both events. And therefore, if you want my discussion and my analysis of Apollo 11, please read it in the September issue of my magazine, The Objectivist. I shall merely quote the essential point of that article. Quote, "No one could doubt that we had seen an achievement of man in his capacity as a rational being, an achievement of reason, of logic, of mathematics, of total dedication to the absolutism of reality. The most confirmed evader in a worldwide audience could not escape the fact that no feelings, wishes, urges, instincts, or lucky conditioning could have achieved this incomparable feat, that we were watching the embodied concretization of a single faculty of man, his rationality." Close quote. This was the meaning and motive of the overwhelming worldwide response to Apollo 11, whether the cheering crowds knew it consciously or not, and most of them did not. It was the response of people starved for the sight of an achievement, for a vision of man the hero. This was the motive that drew 1 million people to Cape Kennedy for the launching. Those people were not a stampeding herd nor a manipulated mob. They did not wreck the Florida communities. They did not devastate the countryside. They did not throw themselves like whining thugs at the mercy of their victims. They did not create any victims. They came as responsible individuals, able to project the reality of 2 or 3 days ahead and to provide for their own needs. There were people of every age, creed, color, educational level, and economic status. They lived and slept in tents or in their cars, some of them for several days, in great discomfort and unbearable heat. They did it gamely, cheerfully, gaily. They projected a general feeling of confident goodwill, the bond of a common enthusiasm. They created a public spectacle of responsible privacy, and they departed as they had come, without benefit of press agents. The best account of the nature of the general feeling was given to me by an intelligent young woman of my acquaintance. She went to see the parade of the astronauts when they came to New York. For a few brief moments, she stood on a street corner and waved to them as they went by. Quote, "It was so wonderful," she told me. People didn't want to leave after the parade had passed. They just stood there talking about it, talking to strangers, smiling. It was so wonderful to feel for once that people aren't vicious, that one doesn't have to suspect them, that we have something good in common. Unquote. This is the essence of a genuine feeling of human brotherhood, the brotherhood of values. This is the only authentic form of unity among men, and only values can achieve it. There was virtually no comment in the press on the meaning of the popular response to Apollo 11. The comments, for the most part, were superficial, perfunctory, mainly statistical. There was a brief flurry of nonsense about unity, as if it were some mysteriously causeless emotional primary, with suggestions about directing this unity to such inspiring goals as the crusades against poverty, air pollution, wilderness desecration, even urban transportation. Then the subject was dropped, and the Apollo 11 story was dropped as of no further significance. One of the paradoxes of our age is the fact that the intellectuals, the politicians, and all the sundry voices that choke like asthma at the throat of our communications media have never gasped and stuttered so loudly about their devotion to the public good and about the people's will as the supreme criterion of value, and never have they been so grossly indifferent to the people. The reason, obviously, is that collectivist slogans serve as a rationalization for those who intend not to follow the people, but to rule it. There is, however, a deeper reason. The most profound breach in this country is not between the rich and the poor, but between the people and the intellectuals. In their view of life, the American people are predominantly Apollonian. The mainstream intellectuals are Dionysian. This means the people are reality-oriented, common-sense-oriented, technology-oriented. The intellectual calls this materialistic and middle class. The intellectuals are emotion-oriented and seek in panic an escape from a reality they are unable to deal with and from a technological civilization that ignores their feelings. The flight of Apollo 11 brought this out into the open. With rare exceptions, the intellectuals resented its triumph. A 2-page survey of their reactions, published by the New York Times on July 21st, was an almost unanimous spread of denigrations and denunciations. See my article, Apollo 11. What they denounced was technology. What they resented was achievement and its source, reason. The same attitude, with rare exceptions, was displayed by the popular commentators, who are not the makers, but the products and the weather vanes of the prevailing intellectual trends. Walter Cronkite of CBS was a notable exception. But Eric Sevareid of CBS was typical of the trend. On July 15th, the eve of the launching, he broadcast from Cape Kennedy a commentary that was reprinted in Variety, July 23rd. Quote, "In Washington and elsewhere, the doubts concern future flights, their number, their cost, and their benefits, as if the success of Apollo 11 were already assured. We are a people who hate failure. It's un-American. It is a fair guess that failure of Apollo 11 would not curtail future space programs, but re-energize them." Unquote. Please consider these two sentences. We are a people who hate failure. It's un-American. In the context of the rest, this was not intended as a compliment, so it should have been. It was intended as sarcasm. But who doesn't hate failure? Should one love it? Is there a nation on earth that doesn't hate it? Surely one would have to say that failure is un-British or un-French or un-Chinese. I can think of only one nation to whom this would not apply. Failure is not un-Russian. I mean this in a sense which is deeper than politics, philosophically. But what Mr. Severide had in mind was not failure. It was the American dedication to success that he was deriding. It is true that no other nation as a whole is as successful as America, which is America's greatest virtue. But success is never automatically immediate. Passive resignation is not a typical American trait. Americans seldom give up. It is this precondition of success, the try again precept, that Mr. Severide was undercutting. He went on to say that if Apollo 11 succeeded, quote, "the pressure to divert these great sums of money to inner space, terra firma, and inner man will steadily grow," unquote. He went on to discuss the views of men who believe, quote, "that this adventure, however majestic its drama, is only one more act of escape, that it is man once again running away from himself and his real needs, that we are approaching the bright side of the moon with the dark side of ourselves." Do you agree with that? I don't. Continuing the quote, "We know that the human brain will soon know more about the composition of the moon than it knows about the human brain and why human beings do what they do," unquote. This last sentence is true, and one would think that the inescapable conclusion is that man should use his brain to study human nature by the same rational methods he has used so successfully to study inanimate matter. But not according to Mr. Severide. He reaches a different conclusion. Quote, "It is possible that the divine spark in man will consume him in flames, that the big brain will prove our ultimate flaw like the dinosaur's big body, that the metal plaque Armstrong and Aldrin expect to place on the moon will become man's epitaph," unquote. This means that the solution is for man to give up his big brain. On July 20th, while Apollo 11 was approaching the moon and the world was waiting breathlessly, Mr. Severide found it appropriate to broadcast the following remark. "No matter how great this event," he said, "nothing much has changed. Quote, man still puts his pants on one leg at a time. He still argues with his wife," unquote, etc. Well, each to his own hierarchy of values and of importance. On the same day, David Brinkley of NBC observed that since men can now see and hear everything directly on television by sensory perceptual means, as he stressed, commentators are no longer needed at all. This implies that perceived events will somehow provide man automatically with the appropriate conceptual conclusions. The truth is that the more men perceive, the more they need the help of commentators, but of commentators who are able to provide a conceptual analysis. According to a fan letter I received from Canada, the United States TV commentaries during Apollo 11's flight were mild compared to those on Canadian television. Quote, "We listened to an appalling panel of experts disparage the project as a mere technological cleverness by a stupid, pretentious speck of dust in the cosmos. They were also very concerned about the inflated American ego if the voyage succeeded. One almost got the impression that they would be greatly relieved if the mission failed," unquote. Such are today's intellectuals, or the majority of them. What is the actual motive behind this attitude? The unadmitted, subconscious motive. An intelligent American newsman, Harry Reasoner of CBS, named it inadvertently. I had the impression that he did not realize the importance of his own statement. Many voices at the time were declaring that the success of Apollo 11 would destroy the poetic romantic glamour of the moon, its fascinating mystery, its appeal to lovers and to human imagination. Harry Reasoner summed it up by saying simply, quietly, a little sadly, that if the moon is found to be made of green cheese, it will be a blow to science. But if it isn't, it will be a blow to, quote, those of us whose life is not so well organized, unquote. And this is the whole shabby secret. To some men, the sight of an achievement is a reproach, a reminder that their own lives are irrational and that there is no loophole, no escape from reason and reality. Their resentment is the cornered Dionysian element bearing its teeth. What Harry Reasoner's statement implied was the fact that only the vanguard of the Dionysian cohorts is made up of wild, rampaging irrationalists, openly proclaiming their hatred of reason, dripping wine and blood. The bulk of Dionysus' strength, his grassroots following, consists of sedate little souls who never commit any major crime against reason, who merely indulge their petty irrational whims once in a while, covertly, and overtly seek a balance of power, a compromise between whims and reality. But reason is an absolute. In order to betray it, one does not have to dance naked in the streets with vine leaves in one's hair. One betrays it merely by sneaking down the back stairs. Then someday one finds oneself unable to grasp why one feels no joy at the scientific discoveries that prolong human life, or why the naked dancers are prancing all over one's own body. Such are the Dionysian followers. But who are the leaders? These are not always obvious or immediately identifiable. For instance, the greatest Dionysian in history was a shriveled little square, well past 30, who never drank or smoked pot, but who did attend the coffee house with such precise, monotonous regularity that the townspeople set their clocks by him. His name was Immanuel Kant. This is the first hippie in history. but a generalissimo of that kind needs lieutenants and non-commissioned officers. Apollo cannot be defeated by buck privates who are merely the conditioned products of their officers. Nor can the buck privates unleash the Dionysian hordes on the world out of the zoos, the coffee houses, and the colleges where they are bred. To do that job and to blindfold the keepers requires some men of stature, but men with a split face who have worn an Apollonian half-mask on the side turned to the world, thus convincing the unwary that a compromise is possible. This brings us to one of Kant's non-commissioned officers, one out of many, but he is typical, a man who serves as a transmission belt to Dionysus and to Woodstock, Charles A. Lindbergh. 42 years ago, Lindbergh was a hero. His great feat, the solo flight across the Atlantic, had required major virtues, including a significant degree of rationality. As a grim demonstration of the nature of man's volition, of the fact that neither rationality nor any other virtue is automatically permanent, but requires a constant volitional practice, I offer in evidence a letter from Lindbergh commenting on Apollo 11's coming flight, published in Life magazine, July 4, 1969. It demonstrates what is left of what had once been a hero. Mr. Lindbergh confesses that he does not know all the motives that prompted him to fly the Atlantic, which of course proves nothing but a failure of introspection. Quote, "But I can say quite definitely that they sprang more from intuitions than from rationality, and that the love of flying outweighed practical purposes, important as the latter often were," unquote. Observes that the choice and love of one's profession are here regarded as having no connection with rationality or with practical purposes, whatever this might be. Quote, "Then, as the art of flying transposed to a science, I found my interest in airplanes decreasing. Rationally, I welcomed the advances that came with self-starters, closed cockpits, radio, and automatic pilots. Intuitively, I felt revolted by them, for they upset the balance between intellect and senses that had made my profession such a joy," unquote. A great deal could be identified in this sort of statement about the nature of Mr. Lindbergh's intuition and about the motives he finds so mysterious. But I shall let him speak for himself and let you draw your own conclusions. Quote, "And so, as intuition had led me into aviation in the first place, it led me back to an early boyhood interest, the contemplation of life," unquote. He does not state by what means he intended to contemplate it, since he had rejected reason. Quote, "I found the mechanics of life less interesting than the mystical qualities they manifest. With these conclusions, I began studying supersensory phenomena, and in 1937 flew to India in the hope of gaining insight to yogic practices," unquote. Some years later, he states, he made expeditions into the wilderness of Africa, Eurasia, and the American continents, which gave him a new perspective, quote, "a perspective that drove into my bones as well as into my mind the fact that in instinct rather than in intellect is manifest the cosmic plan of life," unquote. When he attended the launching of Apollo 8, he was momentarily impressed. Quote, "Talking to astronauts and engineers, I felt an almost overwhelming desire to re-enter the fields of aeronautics, with their scientific committees, laboratories, factories, and blockhouses, possibly to voyage into space myself. But I know I will not return to them, despite limitless possibilities for invention, exploration, and adventure. Why not? Decades spent in contact with science and its vehicles have directed my mind and senses to areas beyond their reach. I now see scientific accomplishment as a path, not an end, a path leading to and disappearing in mystery. Unquote. Observe the motive of placing one's own motives outside the power of reason. It permits one to regard an explanation of that kind as satisfactory and an epistemological claim of that kind as requiring no further proof. From the incoherent paragraphs that follow, one can gather only that what Mr. Lindbergh holds against science is the fact that science does not give us omniscience and omnipotence. Quote, scientific knowledge argues that space vehicles can never attain the speed of light, which makes a puny penetration of the universe within a human lifespan, and that therefore cosmic distances will confine our physical explorations to those planets which orbit the sun. Scientifically established principles now seem to limit man to the space territory of the minor star he orbits. We are blocked by a lack of time as we were once blocked by a lack of air. Unquote. But, he wonders, are we perhaps cracking open the entrance to another era, one that will, quote, one that will surpass the era of science as the era of science surpassed that of religious superstition? Following the paths of science, we become constantly more aware of mysteries beyond scientific reach. In this vaguely apprehended azimuth, I think the great adventures of the future lie in voyages inconceivable by our 20th century rationality, beyond the solar system, through distant galaxies, possibly through peripheries untouched by time and space. Unquote. If this does not make sense to you, the fault lies in your 20th century rationality. Mr. Lindbergh claims a different means of cognition. Quote, we know that tens of thousands of years ago, man departed from both the hazards and the security of instincts, natural selection, and that his intellectual reactions have become too powerful to permit him ever to return. We must find a way to blend with our present erratic tyranny of mind the countless subtle and still little known elements that created the tangible shape of man and his intangible extensions. Unquote. There follows an incoherent pain to, quote, wildness, unquote. Not nature, but wildness. In wildness, as opposed to technological progress and civilization, Mr. Lindbergh has found, quote, a direction, an awareness of values, and the means of our salvation, unquote. To help you untangle this, I can only quote Ellsworth's Dewey in The Fountainhead. Don't bother to examine a folly. Ask yourself only what it accomplishes. Mr. Lindbergh accomplished the following, quote, if we can combine our knowledge of science with the wisdom of wildness, if we can nurture civilization through roots in the primitive, man's potentialities appear to be unbounded. He can merge with the miraculous, to which we can attach what better names than God. And in this merging, as long sensed by intuition, but still only vaguely perceived by rationality, experience may travel without need for accompanying life. Will we then find life to be only a stage, though an essential one, in a cosmic evolution of which our evolving awareness is beginning to become aware? Will we discover that only without spaceships can we reach the galaxies? That only without cyclotrons can we know the interior of atoms? To venture beyond the fantastic accomplishment of this physically fantastic age, sensory perception must combine with the extrasensory, and I suspect that the two will prove to be different faces of each other, unquote. What are the puny little compromises sought by today's politicians compared to a quest for a compromise of this kind? I have said in Atlas Shrugged that mysticism is anti-man, anti-mind, anti-life. I received violent protests from mystics assuring me that this was not true. Observe that Mr. Lindbergh regards life, spaceships, and cyclotrons as equally dispensable, that he talks of experience which travels without need for accompanying life, and that his intuition promises him achievements greater than those reached by the advocates of life, reason, and civilization. Well, reality has obliged. He does not have to wait for tens of thousands of years for evolution, for a reunion with wildness, for intergalactic travel. The goal, the ideal, the salvation, and the ecstasy have been achieved by 300,000 people wallowing in the mud on an excrement-strewn hillside near Woodstock. Their name for the experience of travel unaccompanied by life to peripheries untouched by time and space is LSD trips. The Woodstock Music and Art Fair did not take place in Woodstock. Like everything else about that event, its title was a phony. An attempt to cash in on the artistic reputation of the Woodstock community. The fair took place on an empty 1,000-acre pasture leased by the promoters from a local farmer. In response to $200,000 worth of publicity and advertising, 300,000 hippies showed up for the occasion. These figures are from the New York Times. Some sources place the attendance estimate higher. According to Newsweek, the 3-day Woodstock Fair was different from the usual pop festival from the outset. Quote, "It was not just a concert, but a tribal gathering, expressing all the ideas of the new generation, communal living away from the cities, getting high, digging art, clothes, and craft exhibits, and listening to the songs of revolution." Unquote. The article quotes one of the promoters as declaring, quote, "People will all be going into their own thing. This is not just music, but the conglomeration of everything involved in the new culture." Unquote. So it was. No living, eating, or sanitary facilities were provided. The promoters claimed that they had not expected so large a crowd. Newsweek describes the condition as follows. Festival food supplies were almost immediately exhausted, and water coming from wells dug into the area stopped flowing or came up impure. A heavy rain Friday night turned the amphitheater into a quagmire and the concession area into a mud hole. Throngs of wet, sick, and wounded hippies trekked to impromptu hospital tents, suffering from cold, sore throats, broken bones, barbed wire cuts, and nail puncture wounds. Festival doctors called it a health emergency, and 50 additional doctors were flown in from New York City to meet the crisis. Unquote. According to the New York Times, August 18, when the rainstorm came, quote, "At least 80,000 young people sat or stood in front of the stage and shouted obscenities at the darkened skies." As trash rolled down the muddy hillside with the runoff of the rain. Others took shelter in dripping tents, lean-tos, cars, and trucks. Many boys and girls wandered through the storm nude, red mud clinging to their bodies, unquote. Drugs were used, sold, shared, or given away during the entire festival. Eyewitnesses claim that 99% of the crowd smoked marijuana, but heroin, hashish, LSD, and other stronger drugs were peddled openly. The nightmare convulsions of so-called bad trips were a common occurrence. One young man died, apparently from an overdose of heroin. The Newsweek report concludes with, quote, the promoters had hired members of the hog farm, a New Mexico hippie commune, to peacefully police the fair. At week's end, near the hog farm campsite, a hardcore of crazies barked like dogs and freaked out in a bizarre circle dance lit by flashing strobe lights. The songs seemed to sum up what the young Aquarians believed, despite all misadventures, the festival was all about. Now, now, now is all there is. Love is all there is. Love is love. Unquote. Who paid for this love feast? Apparently the unloved ones. Those who know that there is more than the now for a human being, and that without it, even the now is not possible. The citizens of Bethel, the nearest community, were the victims, abandoned by their law enforcing agencies. These victims were neither bums nor millionaires. They were farmers or small businessmen who worked hard to earn their living. Their stories, reported in the New York Times August 20th, sound like those of the survivors of a foreign invasion. Richard C. Joyner, the operator of the local post office and general store on Route 17B, quote, said that the youngsters at the festival had virtually taken over his property, camping on his lawn, making fires on his patio, and using the backyard as a latrine. Clarence W. Townsend, who runs a 150-acre dairy farm, was shaken by the ordeal. We had thousands of cars all over our fields, he said. There were kids all over the place. They made a human cesspool of our property and drove through the cornfields. There's not a fence left on the place. They just tore them up and used them for firewood. My pond is a swamp, said Royden Gabriel, another farm. I've got no fences, and they used my field as a latrine. They picked corn and camped all over the place. They just landed wherever they could. We pulled 30 of them out of the haymow smoking pot. If they come back next year, I don't know what I'll do. If I can't sell, I'll just burn the place down. Unquote. No love or thought was given to these victims by the unsanitary apostles of love, and someday the world will discover that without thought, there can be no love. Furthermore, the universal loving was not extended by the promoters of the festival even to one another. Quote, in the aftermath of Woodstock, writes the New York Times, September 9, as the euphoria of the 3 days of peace and music dies out, the tales of the problems, the bickering, the power struggles, and the diverse philosophies of the 4 young businessmen are coming out. Unquote. The promoters were 4 young men, all of them in their 20s. One of them, the heir to a drugstore products fortune, pledged his fortune to cover the festival's losses. Inasmuch as the Woodstock hordes broke down the ticket-selling procedure and half the people got in without paying the $7 admission, the fair was a financial disaster, according to the young heir, who said in an earlier story that his debts might reach $2 million. Now the four promoters are splitting up and fighting over control of the Woodstock Ventures Corporation. One of them was described as, quote, a hippie who keeps one foot in the financial world and at all times, and as a boy who eschews shoes, shirts, and barbers, but who likes chauffeured Cadillacs and overseas jet travel and plunges in the stock market, unquote. All of them apparently have connections with several large establishment-oriented corporations and Wall Street investment firms who are interested in cashing in on the youth market. One of these four stated openly, quote, maybe the best way to define the underground industrial complex is materialistic people of the underground trying to make money off of a generation of underground kids who feel they aren't materialistic, unquote. The problems that plagued these promoters, quote, before, during, and after the festival reflect the difficulties in merging the ideas of making money off the kids and trying to let the kids believe that a rock festival, for example, is, as one of them likes to put it, a groovy meeting of the tribes, a part of the revolution, unquote. If this is disgusting, there is something more disgusting still. The psychology of those hundreds of thousands of underground kids who, in justice, deserve no better. Under the title Woodstock, Like It Was, the New York Times, August 25th, published a lengthy interview with 6 young people who had attended the festival. The interview gives only their first names. 5 boys, Steve, Lindsay, Bill, Jimmy, and Dan, and 1 girl, Judy. Most of them were college students. The youngest one was a 16-year-old junior at one of the city's better private schools. All were from comfortable middle-class backgrounds. I shall quote some of this interview. It is a remarkable psychological document. Quote, question, why did you want to go to the festival? Lindsay, it was the music. I wanted to go because of the music. That was the only reason. Judy, they had the most fantastic lineup of stars that I've ever heard about. More than any place I've ever heard of. Better than Newport. Question, did you have any idea where you'd sleep or what there would be to eat? Judy, well, we drove down in a caravan of 2 cars. There were 4 girls and 2 guys, but we were supposed to meet 20 or 30 other people who were driving down from New Hampshire, and they were supposed to bring a tent, but we never met each other. We just scattered. Question, what about food? Judy, we brought a bag of carrots and some soda. Question, did you expect to be able to buy more there? Judy, we never really thought about it. Unquote. When they were asked what they felt at the scene, Judy answered, quote, I just had a feeling that, wow, there are so many of us, we really have power. I'd always felt like such a minority, but I thought, wow, we're a majority. It felt like that. I felt, here's the answer to anyone who calls us deviates. Question, was that before you heard any music? Judy, I never made it to the concert. I never heard any music at all. Question, the whole weekend? Judy, yeah, the whole weekend. Unquote. Further, all the participants stressed a sense of what they called community. Quote, Steve, everyone came there to be together. Not that everyone would cease to be an individual, but everyone came there to be able to express their lifestyle. Question, was there a lot of sharing? A voice, everything was shared. Bill, I was sitting in a group of people and it was hot and the sun was beating down. All of a sudden, you'd have a box of Cocoa Puffs hit you in the side. They'd say, take a handful and pass it on. And like Saturday afternoon, we were sitting there, and this watermelon came by. You haven't heard anything yet. And this watermelon came by with 3 mouthfuls taken out of it. You were supposed to take a bite and pass it on. Because some guy 3 rows over said, give those people some watermelon, unquote. Further, all the panel participants carried some kind of drug to the festival, mostly marijuana. Quote, not infrequently, drugs were given away by young people eager to share. What couldn't be had free could be bought from dealers roaming freely through the crowd. Most of the participants regarded the drugs as an essential part of the scene. Question, how much of the time were you people up there stoned? That is, deeply drugged. Lindsay, about 102%. Question, could you have had the festival without the drugs? Steve, I'm sure there were people there you would have had trouble with if there had not been drugs there. One of the boys remarked that some of the older ones were using cocaine. Question, the older ones? How old? Judy, about 24 or 26, unquote. When they were asked what they wanted to be in the future, they answered as follows. Quote, Jimmy, all my life I've had just about everything I want. And I have to have whatever I want for the rest of my life. Except from now on, I have to begin to think of how to provide it for myself. And I don't want to work because I can't have everything and do everything I want if I have to stay in the same place from 9 to 5. Judy, I'm going to try everything at least once. I lived on a communal farm for a month on the Cape. And, well, I liked it, and I really enjoyed staying there, and I've always wanted to go back and try this thing again, grow tomatoes and things. Question, do you want a family? Judy, 1 child, just, to procreate. But I don't want a family because I don't want to get into that much responsibility. I want to be able to move. I want to be able to leave at any time. I don't want that much restriction, unquote. Further in the interview, quote, question, was sex an important part of the scene at Woodstock? Then, it was just a part. I don't know if it was an important part or not. Steve, in any society of 500,000 people over the course of 3 days, you're going to have sex, let's face it. Jimmy, they were no more free or less free in Woodstock than they are any other place. Then, there was some society to what people did. I mean, they waited until night. Question, you mean there were certain standards of decorum? Then, I think there were, yes. People still have some reservations. Some, not as many. Close quote. Had enough? Has it ever occurred to you that it is not an accident, but the psychological mechanism of projection that has made people of this kind choose to call their opponents pigs? These are the young people whom the press is hailing as a new culture and as a movement of great moral significance. The same press and the same intellectuals who dismissed or denounced Apollo 11 as mere technology. Of the publications I have read, Newsweek was the most fastidious in regard to Woodstock. It offered no praise. The New York Times started by denouncing the festival in an editorial entitled Nightmare in the Catskills, August 18th, but reversed itself the next day and published an editorial with a softened tone. Time magazine went whole hog. It published an essay under the title, The Message of History's Biggest Happening, August 29. This included such statements as, quote, as the moment when the special culture of U.S. youth of the 60s openly displayed its strength, appeal, and power, it may well rank as one of the significant political and sociological events of the age, unquote. And, quote, the spontaneous community of youth that was created at Bethel was the stuff of which legends are made, unquote. Life magazine published a special edition devoted to the Woodstock Festival. The best skills that technology has created in the field of color photography was used to fill that issue with beautiful pictures of scummy young savages. The hippies are right in one respect. The culture of today's establishment is done for. It is rotted through and through. And rebelling against it is like rebelling against a dead horse. The hippies are wrong, however, when they fancy themselves to be rebels. They are the distilled essence of the establishment's culture. They are the embodiment of its soul. They are the personified ideal of generations of crypto-Dionysians now leaping into the open. Among the various types of today's younger generation, the hippies are the most docile conformists. Unable to generate a thought of their own, they have accepted the philosophical beliefs of their elders as unchallengeable dogma, just as in earlier generations, the weakest among the young conformed to the fundamentalist view of the Bible. The hippies were taught by their parents, their neighbors, their tabloids, and their college professors that faith, instinct, and emotion are superior to reason, and they obeyed. They were taught that material concerns are evil, that the state or the Lord will provide, that the lilies of the field do not toil, and they obeyed. They were taught that love, indiscriminate love for one's fellow man, is the highest virtue, and they obeyed. They were taught that the merging of oneself with a herd, a tribe, or a community is the noblest way for men to live, and they obeyed. There isn't a philosophical idea of today's establishment which they have not accepted and which they do not share. When they discovered that this philosophy did not work, because in fact it cannot work, the hippies had neither the wit nor the courage to challenge it. They found instead an outlet for their impotent frustration by accusing their elders of hypocrisy, as if hypocrisy were the only obstacle to the realization of their dreams. And left blindly, helplessly lobotomized in the face of an inexplicable reality that is not amenable to their feelings, they have no recourse but to the shouting of obscenities at anything that frustrates their whims, at men or at a rainy sky, indiscriminately, with no concept of the difference. It is typical of today's culture that these exponents of teasing, raging hostility are taken as advocates of love. Avowed anti-materialists, whose only manifestation of rebellion and of individualism takes the material form of the clothes they choose to wear, are a pretty ridiculous spectacle. Of any type of nonconformity, this is the easiest to practice and the safest. But even in this issue, there is a special psychological component. Observe the hippies' choice of clothing. It is not intended to make them look attractive, but to make them look grotesque. It is not intended to evoke admiration, but to evoke mockery and pity. One does not make oneself look like a caricature unless one intends one's appearance to plead, "Please don't take me seriously." And there is a kind of malicious wink, a contemptuous sneer in the public voices acclaiming the hippies as heroes. The hippies are a desperate herd looking for a master, to be taken over by anyone. Anyone who would tell them how to live without demanding the effort of thinking. Theirs is the mentality ready for a Führer. The hippies The hippies are the living demonstration of what it means to give up reason and to rely on one's primeval instincts, urges, intuitions, and whims. With such tools, they are unable to grasp even what is needed to satisfy their wishes. For example, the wish to have a festival. Where would they be without the charity of the local squares who fed them? Where would they be without the 50 doctors rushed from New York to save their lives, without the automobiles that brought them to the festival, without the soda pop and beer they substituted for water, without the helicopters that brought the entertainers, without all the achievements of the technological civilizations they denounce? Left to their own devices, they literally didn't know enough to come in out of the rain. Their hysterical incantations of worship of the now were sincere. The immediate moment is all that exists for the perceptual level, concrete-bound, animal-like mentality, because to grasp tomorrow is an enormous abstraction, an intellectual feat open only to the conceptual, that is the rational level of consciousness. Hence their state of stagnant, resigned passivity. If no one comes to help them, they will sit in the mud. If a box of Cocoa Puffs hits them in the side, they'll eat it. If a communally chewed watermelon comes by, they'll chew it. If a marijuana cigarette is stuck into their mouths, they'll smoke it. If not, not. How can one act when the next day or hour is an impenetrable black hole in one's mind? And how can one desire or feel? The obvious truth is that these Dionysian desire worshippers do not really desire anything. All of them are seeking desperately for somebody who will provide them with something they will be able to enjoy or to desire. Desires, too, are a product of the conceptual faculty. But there is one emotion which is not, and which the hippies do experience intensely: chronic fear. If you have seen any of them on television, you have seen it leaping at you from the screen. Fear is their brand, their hallmark. Fear is the special vibration by which they claim to recognize each other. I have mentioned the nature of the bond uniting the admirers of Apollo 11, the brotherhood of values. The hippies, too, have a brotherhood, but of a different kind. It is the brotherhood of fear. It is fear that drives them to seek the warmth, the protection, the safety of a herd. When they speak of merging themselves into a greater whole, it is their fear that they hope to drown in the undemanding waves of unfastidious human bodies. And what they hope to fish out of that pool is the momentary illusion of an unearned personal significance. But all discussions or arguments about the hippies are almost superfluous in the face of one overwhelming fact. Most of the hippies are drug addicts. I will assume that your bullying is directed at the hippies because this is a fact. I didn't create it. I object to it also. Go and boo the drugs. Is there any doubt that drug addiction is an escape from an unbearable inner state, from a reality that one cannot deal with, from an atrophying mind one can never fully destroy? If Apollonian reason were unnatural to man, and Dionysian intuition brought him closer to nature and truth, the apostles of irrationality would not have to resort to drugs. Happy, self-confident men do not seek to get stoned. Drug addiction is the attempt to obliterate one's consciousness, the quest for a deliberately induced insanity. As such, it is so obscene and evil that any doubt about the moral character of its practitioners is itself an obscenity. Such is the nature of the conflict of Apollo versus Dionysus. You have all heard the old bromide to the effect that man has his eyes on the stars and his feet in the mud. It is usually taken to mean that man's reason and his physical senses are the element pulling him down to the mud, while his mystical, supra-rational emotions are the element that lifts him to the stars. This is the grimmest inversion of many in the course of mankind's history. But last summer, reality offered you a literal dramatization of the truth. It is man's irrational emotions that bring him down to the mud. It is man's reason that lifts him to the stars. Thank you.
Ayn Rand addressing the Ford Hall Forum on the topic Apollo 11 and Dionysus at Woodstock. It should be noted at this time that a sizable portion of the capacity audience has risen to its feet. We'll return to the forum for the question and answer period following a brief pause for station identification. This is the Eastern Public Radio Network. You are listening to the Ford Hall Forum, coming to you from Boston. Our speaker this evening, Ayn Rand. And now we go to the platform and forum president, Judge Reuben Laurie, for the question and answer period.
Some of you may be puzzled as to why I have two mics in front of me. One mic goes back to the station, and the other is a loudspeaker that enables you to hear me. And if you should detect any opposition or resentment one to the other, it is for reasons that I cannot rationally explain. I want to say a word or two about the question period. This is a unique tribute to Miss Rand, obviously, in view of the weather, and it will be quite impossible for me to be unfair to the various groups here, and so what I intend to do is to take a question from each section except this center section, where I'll take two, and then one from the others and into the balcony and onto the stage, providing we have time. I want to say a word about our question period for those of you who may not know the forum. Miss Rand is our guest. We have welcomed her. The questions may be as sharp as the human mind can make them. They must be courteous. You are free to express disagreement. And as Carlyle once put it to a close friend of his, he said, as they parted, "We have had a thoroughly agreeable evening and have been in accord in everything except our opinions." Questions, please. Yes?
I would like to ask Ms. Rand, I have read many of your books, and wondered if in, say, the last 25 years she has ever had an important change of opinion, a philosophical.
This young lady says she has read many of your books, and she wonders whether in the last 25 years you have had any major change in your philosophical opinion.
Oh, I think you make it too restricted. Put it this way. In the last 64 years, I have not. Not philosophical opinions, if you understand the term, that is fundamental views of the nature of man, of existence, and of the means of human knowledge and human values. I certainly have learned a great deal in these years and in the last 25 years, and I have improved very frequently some formulations, some details of the conclusions which I reached, but never the philosophy nor the fundamentals.
Question here. This gentleman here. Come on, come on.
Ms. Rand, you obviously have got a very brilliant and a very keen mind. I would like to point out, however, something that I think that you would probably agree with, and that is that our rationality provides the means to ends. The ends themselves, by their nature, must be produced irrationality, irrational. And for instance, the Apollo flight itself, I think, is a tremendous example of this. The Apollo flight is not a rational flight for the following reason.
Wait a minute, my friend. Wait a minute, my friend. We permit a question. Remember, the speaker is on the platform. Quiet, please. Just 1 minute. Just 1 minute. I don't know who you are that's making these unpleasant noises, but may I say a word or two? I would encourage you to return to this forum Sunday after Sunday and learn our ways. We listen here. A child can make these unpleasant noises. If I get to you, I may not be able to recognize you, else I would permit you to put a question, and you might have some difficulty. Now let us have the question.
Ms. Rand, please suggest a rational reason for going to the moon, either on an economic basis, or a military basis, or a human biological.
I get it. Will you kindly, all quiet please, will you kindly suggest a truly rational reason for seeking to go to the moon, either on an economical basis, a philosophical basis, or any basis whatsoever?
I will start by answering the last part of your question, and then I'd like to go to the beginning. Yes, a very simple reason, the extension of knowledge. Everything that man have undertaken, and in fact, in every rational endeavor, only by the constant extension of the Apollo program to the military program, but I would hope, I'm merely expressing a personal hope, that it has an enormous value, or might have in the future, for military purposes, for purposes of self-defense. Remember that savages worse than the ones in Woodstock, oh much worse, and adult, also are making space journeys or have space vehicles, at least if one can believe it. let us assume that we can, according to such news as we're given. If they are making space exploration, we better try to get to Mars and fast. There is only one thing that you could raise as an objection, and I would agree with you. I do not think they can make it. But so long as that they're trying to, and there are corrupt men of intelligence even in that cesspool, which is communist Russia, if so long as they're trying, we have to try. We are morally obligated to try, because even an animal will not die without fighting in self-defense. Judge Lurie, I just want one word on the first part of this question. I want to thank you for your compliment, but disagree very thoroughly on your statement that only means are chosen by reason, but ends, human ends, have to be chosen irrationally. That is precisely one of the worst axioms or credos in ethics which I am out to fight. That is precisely what has destroyed human ethics or human morality. I do not believe that ends are chosen irrationally. That is the human evil that has taught man that the choice of ends by reason is impossible. Everything that I have written is devoted to proving the exact opposite. We choose our ends by means of reason or we perish. And since you obviously are not too acquainted with my work, I wouldn't ask you to start reading volumes. So I think they're good, but I'm not here to do salesmanship. I would suggest that you just read a short essay of mine entitled The Objectivist Ethics, and that will give you the essence of my stand on this particular issue of ends and means.
This gentleman with the hand up, come on.
Would Mr. Rand please comment upon the rationality behind the recent administration policy against cyclamates, which have been proven not to be harmful?
I get it.
Except for rats.
Go ahead.
And the rationality behind the use of marijuana being a felony because it's a drug of our generation, which hasn't been proven to be harmful.
I get it. Will Miss Grant, please, you're just piling it on. All right, go ahead.
Whereas tobacco, which has been proven to be a harmful drug to human beings, plus the lobbying power of the tobacco industry, the rationale.
I get it. This gentleman asked you to comment upon the rationale or the rationality behind the barring of cyclamates, which he suggests have not altogether been proved. And secondly, with regard to the making of the use of marijuana a felony, marijuana, suggests the gentleman, is a product that is being used by our generation, and if you think that marijuana is only used by the young, you haven't spent as much time as I have in the criminal courts. Now, give this thought. Again, I suggest to some of you who are making these unpleasant noises, don't do it. It impresses nobody, and it serves no purpose. Now, the third matter that he regards as an example of the complete use of irrationality is the fact that tobacco, which he regards as having been proved with regard to the deleterious effect that it has, is being promoted because it makes a profit. And he regards this as requiring a discussion by you as to the rationale behind all this.
First of all, to clear up certain confusion which I believe exists in your mind on my stand. Since I'm obviously a defender of reason, individualism, you can gather from that logically that I'm also a defender of capitalism, pure capitalism. I am not an apologist for the Nixon administration or any mixed economy administration. Yes, I think Nixon is a great improvement over his predecessor, several of them, including Eisenhower, and I did vote for him. But I certainly would not attempt to justify or think that all the laws they pass or measures they take or policies are all rational. No, I am probably more in disagreement with the present policies than I could find some with which I might be in temporary agreement. I do not approve of any government controls over consumption generally of every kind, so as to eliminate this confusion in your mind. I would advocate that all restrictions on drugs be removed. I don't believe that the government has the right to tell adults what they do with their own health and their own life. But that places a much greater moral responsibility on the individual. Just because the government shouldn't prohibit not only marijuana, take the worst of them, whichever it is, heroin, LSD, or cocaine, I don't know what's the worst, or morphine. I don't think the government should prohibit any of them, except, of course, sale to minors. That would be proper. But for adults, I think they should be free to kill themselves in any ways they want to. That is why it is a moral issue. It is the responsibility of the individual not to take the kind of things, physical, chemical things, which destroy his mind. I would say I would fight for your right to use marijuana, and I'd fight you morally to the death that you should not do it, except, of course, in a free society, I wouldn't have to deal with you at all if you want to take it and we disagree. All that the government should do is only protect citizens from the consequences of those who take drugs. That is, if they turn to crime, if they rob in order to provide themselves with money, that is the province of the government. But you know, drugs would be much cheaper if it weren't for government law, just as under prohibition. It was the bootleggers who didn't want the repeal of prohibition because criminals made fortunes. Because alcohol was forbidden. Same here. It is the underworld that is spreading the drug traffic, particularly to the young, and then addicts become new pushers because drugs are so expensive and they need the money. It would be much cheaper and easier and morally much more vicious on the part of anyone who would take drugs if they were permitted by the government. Now, as to cyclamates, that's really a question for a doctor, but to the best information I have, they are harmless. I take them myself in the form of dietary soft drinks and things like that. And as far as I know from doctors, there is nothing to the alleged proofs, not only of cyclamates, but even of cigarettes. Although I grant you doctors are more divided on the issue of cigarettes, but there is a division, only we always hear the negative side. On the issue of cyclamates, except for the original, whoever it was that started it, doctors claim that cyclamates are not harmful. But that is a question really for the doctors to decide and to tell their patients. It's not for the government to pass laws or prohibition on a moment's notice on any one unproved experimenter's whim. You want my hypothesis about why this is done? That comes from the psychology of attacking capitalism. Observe, it's attacking any industry which gives people help or pleasure and which makes money for somebody. They are now going after television dinners in New York. That's supposed to be harmful because it has preservatives in it. And of course, the amount of work it serves to busy housewife is immeasurable. But anything which is of help and which is popular is being attacked, and there is another motive. Such an attack will get you into the newspapers. Look at Ralph Nader. That's the real motive here.
Question here, this lady. Come on. Wait, just a minute. All quiet, please.
At one point when you were talking about Woodstock and the reaction of the people that live there, you mentioned one man, and he said, if they come next year, I do not know what I will do, sell out or burn it down. I wish you would explain. Now, that may sound like an irrational act, but why in that man's case, it's one of the most rational acts he could make, would be to burn that property.
Yes, I get it. This lady says that she has admired your work, Miss Rand, but she found the statement that you attributed and quoted from the farmer at Woodstock who spoke about the destruction of his property and said that he did not know what he would do if they came back next year, but if necessary, he would burn his property down. Now, she asked whether this was an exercise in rationality. Why it is.
Oh, for a very simple reason, isn't it clear? If a man works very hard to make a living, everything on his place and connected with his work is acquired and represents his own effort, probably years of effort. If he sees it being taken over, used and destroyed by literally savages, but self-made savages, which is worse than the kind who are literally in the jungle and innocent and may not know any better, but by literal, well-to-do, middle-class, college-bred savages, which makes it morally unspeakable. Not that I would advocate any more or less privileged people behaving that way, but when you regard the source, there isn't even the shadow, pretense of an excuse. If you see that type of people descending on your property, destroying everything it took you years to build, which will mean that if he doesn't get out of there, how many years, just ask yourself, how many years will it take him to work just to get back to where he was before that invasion, just to make up the losses? Isn't that clear? That neither he nor the others can continue that way, and if the authorities do not protect them, then I would advise them to burn their place down right now. If they could make a national scene out of it, but unfortunately with the trend of our press, they probably wouldn't be heard. So the Times did give them at least this one story. They are thinking of suing the city of Bethel, that's what the story said, for issuing a permit to that festival, but there is a question there. Some officials claim that it was staged without any permit, that no permit were given, and that the paper didn't follow up the story, so I do not know what ultimately happened. But the victims are thinking, as I say, of suing the city and suing this festival corporation. If they do, I wish them the best luck in the world.
Thank you. Question here. Come on. May this young lady look forward to another novel in the near future?
Not in the near future, but don't pin me down to it. I would want to write it, perhaps, I'm sure more than anyone could want to read it, although I appreciate your interest, but I can't advance very fast on it right now because of the objectives. And if you ask me, but why do I devote my time to this magazine? As I answered a friend of mine recently, because I cannot stand to see what is going on in this country and remain silent. Because if I have the ability to express views contrary to the kind of wanton destruction of America's greatness, of the last place of freedom or even semi-individualism on earth, I can't just stand by. And since there is no publications where my views would be expressed without being watered down or maybe expressed once as a freak, I have to run my own publication. The country is still free enough for me to do it.
Question up in the balcony. All quiet, please. Thank you. Do you consider the moratorium on October the 15th and the forthcoming moratorium an act that is rational?
As irrational and as immoral as any public act in our history that I know of. Let me point out one difficulty in expressing this. I am against the war in Vietnam and have been for years ago. I made a speech right here in this forum, I believe 3 or 4 years ago, under the Johnson administration, in regard to my view of Vietnam. But I am not for the victory of the Viet Cong. I am not for unilateral surrender. And when you know that members of your country and your generation by draft, military draft, which I also oppose, are fighting and dying in a war, whatever you do in the nature of protest, you do not ask unilateral surrender, you do not accept compliments from the Viet Cong and good wishes, and you do not distribute Viet Cong flags. Don't you understand? I cannot believe that anybody can fail to understand that by doing anything, undertaking any action which supports a military enemy during an actual war, you are murderers. You are taking on your hands the death of every soldier in Vietnam. I would say we should pull out of there. I say, if somebody asked me if I mystically had the power, except that there is no mysticism, should we pull out of Vietnam tomorrow? I would say yes, we never should have pulled in. It was the fault of the same liberals, the same policies that today is in the forefront of the anti-Vietnam marchers. The product of Kennedy and Johnson, but above all Kennedy, who today, because he's not present, is regarded as an idealistic martyr. But it's he who got us into Vietnam just the same. And the Republicans and Democrats are pretty equally guilty of it, but since it was up to now a Democratic administration, it's their war, and I do not know how short a memory people can have, or if you're young and didn't see it yourself, certainly there's still enough evidence in the newspapers. We don't have censorship or book burning yet. You can look up the record of Vietnam and of Kennedy's speeches about it, of Johnson's speeches, and if you want to go further back, go to World War II and read about the campaign of the same gang, and there is no other word for it, except that today it's a political party, the Democrat-Liberal axis, that were insulting as isolationists everybody who was opposed to our entering World War II. Isolationism was regarded as a very dirty word. You were accused of being narrowly patriotic and selfish because you didn't want to mix into a foreign war. And today, It is suddenly the liberals that are isolationists. Well, look, it's just too, excuse me, goddamn obvious. If one makes any pretense to speak or stand for serious principles, then at least have respect for your audience, do stand for principles, and do not count on the concrete bound mentality of subnormal children who will not understand that you, by which I mean anyone who supports that moratorium, are playing a double standard. It is proper to go to war to fight fascism, you said, or your gang said, but it is not proper to fight communism. And I say one must fight both or neither. And when it comes to this country, here is where we should fight them. But as to any fight for freedom abroad, I believe, let us send all the military equipment that we can spare without sacrifice to any fight for freedom, whether it's of the fascist kind or the communist kind, which is, of course, two variants of the same thing. Don't ever let us dare take American lives to sacrifice them to somebody else's freedom or to sacrifice them in any form. That's my position, and it's on these grounds that I say, if you object to a war, and remember, a war is military action, it is actual shooting, and you as civilians are taking the side favorable to the enemy, that is as low, as immoral, as unspeakable an attitude as anything I, at least, can conceive of.
This gentleman on the aisle, come on. Wait a minute, please. All quiet, please. All right.
Mr. Rand, you seem to be exhibiting a great deal more fear than those of my generation. And I'm wondering...
No personality, please. You're not a psychologist, and I'm not here to be analyzed. You may object to my ideas. You cannot pass on my state of emotions.
All right. Well, that was really the talk that was given tonight. Question, please. Yes? Come on, all quiet, please.
I would like to answer this young man with one sentence. You're quite right, of course. The whole talk was devoted to it, but if you didn't quite get it, I will sum it up. There is no such thing as personal freedom or personal rights or personal anything that stand above and against reason and reality. All your rights, all your freedoms are based on reality and derived from the observation of reality by reason. You don't have the personal freedom to be irrational. Not in morality, you don't. In a free society, of course, you can do it. I mean, you can do whichever you want, so long as you don't break my rights or the rights of others. But if you ask me how do I reconcile with Rourke or any of my heroes, there is no such thing as right apart from and against reason and reality. That's a very important thing to remember.
Now this gentleman, come on.
Yes, at the end of his talk, he said that rational emotion brings down the mind. These outbursts, which he has demonstrated to the students of our age, seems to me as an outburst of emotional irrationalism. Also,
Look, I didn't solicit your opinion.
Wait a minute. All quiet, please. Hold on a minute.
I agree with you that we do not belong in Vietnam. It's to me the most rational thing to stop the killing of American troops in Vietnam is to bring the troops home.
Yes. This gentleman quotes, wait a minute, I have your question. Believe it or not, I have your question. Be seated. He will tell you whether I have it in a minute. Now you will listen. This gentleman says that he regards what took part of the hippies in Woodstock as being a display of emotional rationality. Now he says that in connection with the war in Vietnam, there are those, and he is one, who believes that it is rational to believe that the only way that one can bring these boys home is to do what the moratorium is intended to do. Now the question is,
What's the question?
why is this not an exercise of rationality?
Because I have just answered. Because you are in a war, you are dealing with an irrational enemy who is not willing to make any concession, and in such cases you cannot withdraw unilaterally. There is no way to do it. You would lead to the slaughter of the whole South Vietnam population, as has already been demonstrated if you watch the news. But let's put it this way. Nothing is rational which takes one aspect of a situation on or one desire and focuses only on it. If you say you want to end this war, don't you think the whole country wants to end it? Don't you think that President Nixon and even President Johnson did want to end it? But do you also realize that you ought to be at least somewhere on the outskirts of Washington, by which I mean of a political job, not with full information, but at least with some partial information about the nature of that situation? Merely saying, I want the boys to come back somehow, is irrational, because if you do have this desire, it is obligatory on you to tell the people, the country, or President Nixon and Congress how to do it without destroying the prestige of America in the world and delivering unknown hundreds of thousands of people who trusted us to slaughter. You see, if we hadn't gone into Vietnam, I don't believe it's our responsibility to protect either side in the war. It's their country, let them fight it out. But once we got in and we expected and asked and got the cooperation of the local people to then withdraw when we have the power to fight and abandon those people is quite a monstrous thing. Now, I would still say, no, we shouldn't do it at the expense of American lives. But merely saying, let's stamp on foot and demand that American boys come back is acting like a petulant child stamping his foot at reality. Unfortunately, it can't be done that way. You know where you could help if you take the situation seriously? Try to give it some thought and watch the foreign policy of your country and see to it that no administration, Republican or Democratic, ever puts this country into this position again. Start a slow movement for real political isolationism in the George Washington sense, in the sense of his principle of no foreign entanglements. That's the trouble. You cannot solve the conditions, the problems created by an irrational policy, which is now approximately 50 years old and in certain respects, or older. It's a rational foreign policy brought us to this. What we're seeing is the consequences of irrationality, not the cause. And you cannot solve the consequences or get rid of them simply by wishing it. You have to attack the root and the cause. That's much harder to do than to march in a demonstration, but it can be done.
Question here. This gentleman, come on.
Ms. Rand, I'd like to know what your views on what is your purpose on Earth and what will happen to you after you die?
What is your purpose on earth? Quiet, please. All quiet, please. What is your purpose on earth and what will happen to you when you die? And he would like your views upon this problem.
My first, second, and simplest. I assume what will happen to me when I die is that I'll be buried. I do not believe in any form of life after death, nor any form of mysticism. This doesn't mean that I believe that man's mind is necessarily materialistic, but I don't believe that it is mystical. We know that we have a mind and we have a body and a mind, and that neither can exist without the other. Therefore, when I die, that will be the end of me, the person. I don't think it will be the end of my philosophy.
May I remind you that I set out a method, and I'm trying to adhere to it in fairness to everybody, so please don't raise your hands in this section that I've already passed. Come on.
Ms. Rand, in addition to your dichotomy of reason and emotion, could there be another dichotomy dividing us, that being between productivity, those people who derive their worth from the sense of productivity, and those people who don't have to derive their worth from the sense of productivity? And also, could you maintain your rational faculties if you gave up the idea of productivity as an end in life?
Yes. Could you retain your rationality if you gave up the idea of productivity as an end of life? And is there not a dichotomy between those that are engaged productively and those that do not engage productively?
Well, to take your question from the beginning, you said my dichotomy. I specifically said I deny the existence of any dichotomy between reason and emotion. If you want the detail of my theories, you will find it in my writing, but to state it in one sentence, emotions are the product of your thinking or your evasions. Emotions are the result of your rational faculty, and they're created by you, either chosen consciously or subconsciously. They are a subconscious response, but they are directed by your conscious mind. Therefore, I do not believe there is a dichotomy. It is Nietzsche, it is Lindbergh, it is the hippies who do believe that there is a dichotomy. And why do they believe it? In order to place emotions above reason. It's when you reverse the relationship of reason and emotions, and when you decide that your mind has to be the servant of or the subordinate of your wishes, it's then that you put yourself in a position of an inner conflict and of a dichotomy. I do not believe that a dichotomy in the sense of antagonist with opposite natures and requirements exists, but it is created inside an irrational man and by an irrational society. That's your first dichotomy. Now the second one is what between the productive and the non-productive.
That's right.
Well, you worded it in a somewhat interesting way. You said those who do not feel it's necessary to produce. Is
That's
that
right.
what you said?
That's right.
Well, it would be the neatest trick of the weekend of the century if you could point to me some people who do not find it necessary to produce and who are not supported like parasites by other people. You see, it isn't a dichotomy, and it isn't the personal preference of some men that requires that men produce what they need. That is in the nature, in the metaphysical nature of reality. By metaphysical, I mean as it is, not subject to human change. It is in the nature of man that he has to be productive if he is to survive. Now, if men do, but when I say productive, I do not mean that everybody has to make $1 million or more, or discover new fantastic discoveries each day or fly to the moon. No, one doesn't have to be constantly productive, nor on any particular scale. One has to be productive to the extent of one's own ability and goals. In order to exist at all and in order to make anything of your life or to achieve any values, you need to produce your own material sustenance, and more than that, you need the free leisure, the time to develop your own skill and carry it further, whichever your career or your choice of ability. That's what reality demands. And since there is no escape from it, since bananas do not fall on us from heaven or trees, since man has to work, those who say, I do not feel I have to, mean subconsciously or consciously, and demonstrate it in fact, that they intend to enslave others to support them. That is the immorality and the evil in the position of those who place something, anything, above productivity, when you speak of practical action. Because the first value, of course, is reason, your exercise of rationality. That would enable you to produce. But if in the actual living of your life you do not care to produce, that means you have no values. But if you have no values, then you're a vegetable, not a man. And then, of course, most of the people who are anti-production do have values, parasitical values. There is no other answer to that kind of dichotomy. Now, if anybody went on a desert island and said, I don't want to produce and I will not exploit anybody, that would be his inalienable right. Let him try it out there and see what he'll do if he doesn't care to be productive, and see what will happen to him. And if he wants to die, that's also his choice. But don't let him exploit the living. I just remembered what was the second part of your question. You said, what is my purpose in life? To enjoy my life.
That was his.
To enjoy.
This was the question of this young man.
Oh, I know that I did answer it, and that's a good one.
That's right.
I don't want to appear to evade it. My purpose is to enjoy my life in a rational way, meaning to use my mind to the greatest extent possible to me, to pursue, admire, and support human greatness when it pertains to reason, and to make all my choices, all my decisions by means of my rationality, and to expand my knowledge constantly. I think that's a pretty ambitious program, and I've achieved most of it.
All quiet, please. Wait a minute.
Your biography, Who is Ayn Rand? It was stated in 1940 you enthusiastically supported Wendell Willkie for the presidency of the United States. Do you see anybody on the horizon who would receive your enthusiastic support despite your hostility to politicians?
This gentleman says that in your biography it is mentioned that you enthusiastically supported Wendell Willkie when he was a candidate for president against Franklin Roosevelt. And he wonders whether or not on the horizon there is emerging any political figure who would command your enthusiastic support in view of your attitude towards politicians.
Oh, Judge Louis, you softened something, thank you. As well to say quite properly, but he said in view of my hostility to politicians.
Yeah.
I truly appreciate your reluctance to repeat it. It's improper to put it that way, but since it may not be fully intentional, hostility is a psychological term, someone who hates. I don't hate politicians. Unfortunately, I'm forced to despise them. I would not even say that it would apply to every individual in politics. And I would say that today we are a mixed economy, politically and also morally. Most people in politics and everywhere else are mixed cases. But I'm very much opposed to mixtures. And therefore, could I be enthusiastic about anyone on the scene today? No. Would I say that would they appear in the future? Possibly. It's never impossible, but it would, I think, take some time and a different kind of cultural trend for a proper kind of man of stature to appear on the scene. I do not have any in mind. As to the Wilkie campaign, well, that's one of the things by which one learns from one's mistake. It wasn't a mistake to support him as he appeared, but when that man, a few months after his defeat, announced that all his statements were merely campaign oratory, after that one does not get enthusiastic about candidates. So not all of them are that bad.
Come on.
I'd like to ask 2 questions.
No, one question. It's 1 minute of 10.
Could I like to let Ms. Rand select?
You do the selection. Which question do you want?
What is the objectivist viewpoint, Ms. Rand? What is the property status of air and masses of water?
I get it.
Water as related to pollution.
What is the property status of air and masses of water as related to pollution from the objectivist point of view?
This is not exactly related to today's subject, and it's on a much lower, more concrete scale, but I can answer you briefly. I am against any kind of government controls imposed as preventive issue. In such an issue as pollution, let people demonstrate the actual harm and sue the individual polluters. That has always been a proper division of human rights. If, for instance, you create some kind of unsanitary conditions on your property, which not merely offensive visually, but which can create germs that then invade your neighbor's property, he can sue you. And if he can demonstrate that the damage, a physical damage, comes from your property, he appropriately will be awarded damages, or you will be ordered to clean up the menace. These laws exist already in the realm of relationship between property owners, and the same principle would apply to pollution. Beyond that, I would say before we even touch the issue, you'd have to get all the vested interests out, because it's too easy and pet and ugly an issue that is being pushed by people who make a living out of issues of that kind. I do not believe that capitalists or factory owners want to pollute air. And if and when you can demonstrate to them that they are damaging you without forcing them to close door and then create unemployment for which you also blame them. If that were the approach, then the issue could be discussed sensibly.
Now the hour has come to express our appreciation to Miss Rand.
And once again, this near-capacity crowd attending the Ford Hall Forum in Jordan Hall, about 75% of this crowd has risen to its feet. We applaud this evening's speaker, Ayn Rand, to address the forum on the topic Apollo 11 and Dionysus at Woodstock. Next week, we look forward to the David K. Niles Memorial Meeting.